That child inside you, it isn't mine.
Say that again. Look at me and say that again.
It flatly, without hesitation, the way a man says something he has rehearsed in his head so many times that it no longer feels like a lie to him. She remembers the exact color of the sky that evening, the exact sound of his car door closing before he drove away, and the exact moment she stopped waiting for him to turn around. 2 years later, he was standing on her porch again, holding a small wrapped gift for a little boy he had never once tried to meet, asking her for something he had never once earned. What she did not know that night, and would not learn for 2 more years, was that the lie he told her was not entirely his own. Someone else had built it for him, piece by piece, long before he ever opened his mouth. This is the story of what happens when a family's fear of losing everything costs them the one person who could have saved them, and what it takes for a man to finally understand the difference between protecting his name and protecting the people who loved him. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Clara Bennett, and for most of her 20s she had built her life carefully. The way a person builds something when they have watched their mother build a life out of very little and did not want to repeat the same struggle. She worked as an assistant to an interior designer in a mid-sized city, spending her days surrounded by fabric swatches and floor plans for homes she would never be able to afford herself. And she liked the quiet dignity of that work, the way it let her shape beautiful things without needing anyone's permission to do so. Her mother, Margaret, had raised her alone after Clara's father left when she was 6 years old, taking almost nothing with him and leaving almost nothing behind except a silence that Margaret filled with double shifts, second-hand furniture arranged with more care than money could usually buy, and a fierce insistence that Clara would never grow up believing a man's absence was somehow her fault. Clara grew up watching her mother work 2 jobs and still show up to every school recital, every parent-teacher conference, every ordinary Tuesday that needed showing up for, and somewhere in that watching, Clara had absorbed a quiet belief that love without follow-through was not really love at all. It was just a feeling that people mentioned on their way out the door. Nathaniel Whitfield, who almost everyone called Nate, came from a very different kind of family, the kind whose name appeared on buildings and charity galas and the sides of construction trailers all over the city. His father, Robert Whitfield, had built a real estate development company from a single crumbling apartment block he'd bought at auction in his 20s. And by the time Nate was born, the Whitfield name had become shorthand in certain circles for old money trying very hard to look like it had always been there. Nate was the older of 2 sons, which meant he had spent his entire life being groomed as the heir to something he had never actually asked for, sitting through board meetings as a teenager while his friends were at football practice, learning to shake hands the way his father shook hands, firm and brief and slightly distant, long before he understood why that distance mattered. His younger brother, Julian, had spent that same childhood in the particular kind of resentment that comes from watching someone else get handed the future you secretly believed should have been yours. A resentment that never quite announced itself directly, but showed up sideways, in the jokes that weren't really jokes, in the compliments that always seemed to come with a small barb folded inside them. Their mother, Eleanor Whitfield, ran the family with the precision of a woman who had learned early that reputation was the only inheritance that could not be taxed, insured, or replaced once it was gone. And she managed her sons the way she managed everything else, with warmth on the surface and calculation underneath, so seamlessly blended that neither son could always tell where one ended and the other began. Clara and Nate met at the opening of one of the Whitfield Company's newest residential developments, a glass-fronted building downtown that Clara's design firm had been hired to stage for the unveiling. She was standing on a ladder in the lobby, wrestling with a stubborn curtain panel that refused to hang evenly, muttering under her breath in a way she assumed no one important was around to hear, when Nate walked past in his gray suit, stopped mid-stride, and offered to hold the ladder steady while she finished. He introduced himself with only his first name, and it was nearly 20 minutes into their conversation, After they had already argued cheerfully about whether the building's lighting made the lobby feel welcoming or clinical, before she realized the man holding her ladder was the son of the company whose name was on the building itself. He told her later that what struck him first was that she did not seem to know who he was, and once she found out, she seemed almost more annoyed than impressed, as though his name had made the conversation slightly less interesting rather than more. In a world where every conversation he had ever had carried the faint static of his family's name, that indifference felt like the first breath of clean air he'd had in years. For Clara, what struck her was simpler. He listened. He asked questions and then waited for the answers instead of already thinking about what he would say next. And when she made a joke at his own family's expense about the lobby lighting, he laughed instead of flinching. It had been a long time since anyone had done that for her, and she found herself looking forward to seeing him again before she had even admitted that to herself. What followed was nearly a year of a relationship conducted mostly in a kind of quiet privacy. Dinners at restaurants far enough from downtown that no one would recognize him. Weekends at her apartment rather than his family's estate. Long drives with no destination where they talked about everything except the one subject that mattered most, which was how two people from such different worlds were supposed to eventually make their relationship public without it becoming a story. Nate told her things he had never said out loud to anyone else, including the particular exhaustion of being raised to inherit a legacy he had never fully wanted. The way his father would sometimes look at him during meetings with an expression that was less pride than assessment, and the fear that lived underneath his whole life that he would never quite measure up to the version of himself his father had imagined before he was even born. Clara told him about her own father's absence, about the year in high school when she'd stopped believing anyone would ever choose to stay, and the quiet vow she had made to herself as a teenager that she would never build her life around someone who might disappear the moment things became difficult. In hindsight, that vow would matter more than either of them understood at the time. There were small moments in those months that Clara would return to again and again in the years that followed, moments that felt insignificant when they happened, but took on a different weight later. There was the night Nate mentioned, almost as a joke, that his mother had strong opinions about who belonged in the family and who did not, and that she had a way of making her opinions known without ever raising her voice. A talent Nate described with the particular fondness people reserve for things they haven't yet been hurt by directly. There was the afternoon Julian met Clara for the first and only time before everything changed, at a coffee shop near her office, where Nate had arranged the introduction, hoping it would go well. An afternoon in which Julian looked her over for exactly as long as it took to be rude about it, asked her pointed questions about her family and her income in a tone that pretended to be casual curiosity, and told his brother afterward, in a comment Nate never repeated to Clara until much later, that some people simply were not built for a family like theirs. There was the dinner Nate kept postponing, the one where he was supposed to formally introduce Clara to his mother, a dinner that kept getting rescheduled for reasons that always sounded reasonable in the moment, a work trip, his mother's charity gala, a scheduling conflict that seemed to multiply itself every time the date approached, and only later did those postponements look less like bad luck and more like a man quietly delaying a reckoning he already sensed was coming. There was also, in the 8th month of their relationship, a smaller incident that Clara barely registered at the time, but that would return to her with new significance much later. She had come to pick Nate up from the family estate one evening when his car was in the shop, and while she waited in the entryway, she overheard a leaner on the phone in the next room, her voice pitched low and businesslike, discussing a completely unrelated matter, a zoning dispute over one of the company's developments, but the tone of it stayed with Clara. It was the voice of a woman solving problems the way other people solved crossword puzzles, methodically, without visible emotion, treating an obstacle as simply another variable to be managed. Clara mentioned it to Nate on the drive home, half as a joke, saying his mother sounded like she could talk anyone into or out of anything, and Nate had laughed and agreed, adding, in a comment that felt lighter then than it would feel later, that his mother had never in her life lost an argument she actually cared about winning. Then came the pregnancy, and with it, a shift in the emotional weather of their relationship that Clara felt before she could name it. She remembers telling him on a Sunday afternoon, in her small kitchen with the window open, and the sound of a neighbor mowing a lawn somewhere outside, watching his face carefully because some instinct in her wanted to memorize whatever expression came first, before he had time to arrange it into something more presentable. She saw was not joy, and it was not even fear exactly. It was something closer to calculation, a flicker of a man doing math in his head about consequences he had not planned for, a flicker that lasted less than 2 seconds before he recovered, crossed the kitchen, and held her, telling her he was happy, that they would figure it out together. Clara filed that first unguarded flicker away in a part of her memory she did not examine again until much later, when it would finally make sense. In the days that followed, Nate found himself unable to eat properly, unable to sleep through the night, rehearsing in his head a conversation with his mother that he kept postponing the same way he had postponed the dinner introducing Clara to her in the first place. He finally told Alina on a Thursday evening, choosing a moment when his father was traveling for business, some instinct telling him it would be easier to survive his mother's reaction without his father in the room as well. What Nate did not know, and would not learn until much later, was that he was already too late in believing he controlled the timing of that conversation. Alina had learned about the pregnancy nearly a week earlier, through a housekeeper named Rosalind who had overheard a phone call between Nate and a friend, and out of either loyalty to the family or simple fear of what would happen if she stayed silent, had quietly reported it up the household's chain before Nate had even finished processing the news himself. By the time Nate sat down across from his mother, believing he was delivering unexpected information, Alina had already spent a week deciding exactly how she intended to respond. Alina did not confront her son with anger. She never confronted anyone with anger if she could help it, having learned decades earlier that anger revealed too much and accomplished too little. She waited until he had finished speaking, let a long silence settle over the study, and then began talking, calmly, about legacy, about the company his father had built out of nothing, about the particular kind of scrutiny that came with the family name, and how quickly an unplanned child from a woman outside the family's world could unravel decades of careful positioning if the wrong people decided to make it a story. She spoke about the reporters who had circled the family before, about a cousin's divorce that had made the society pages for months, about how fragile reputation actually was compared to how solid it appeared from the outside. She did not tell Nate what to do. She was too careful for that, too aware that a direct order could be resisted or later blamed on her. Instead, she simply laid out, piece by piece, all the ways his life could unravel, and let her son's own fear do the rest of the work for her. And Nate, who had spent his entire life absorbing the idea that his mother's approval was the ground he stood on, found himself nodding along to things he would later be unable to fully explain, even to himself. What happened next, Nate would not fully understand or admit to for 2 more years. Alina arranged, quietly, through a family friend with connections at a private diagnostic lab the company had used before for unrelated matters, to have a paternity test result manufactured. A piece of manufactured proof designed to be shown to Nate at precisely the moment his fear and her calm authority had made him most susceptible to believing whatever would let him avoid the confrontation he dreaded most. She presented it to him not as evidence to convince him of anything, but almost as a formality, a piece of paper that simply confirmed what she suggested he might have already suspected, that perhaps Clara had not been as honest with him as he believed, that perhaps there were other men he did not know about. Nate looked at that piece of paper in his mother's study and felt something in him give way, not because he wanted to believe it, but because believing it offered him an exit from a conversation he did not know how to survive any other way. Here is where the story takes its first true turn, the moment that would define the next 2 years of 2 people's lives, and the life of a child neither of them could yet imagine. Under the particular pressure of his mother's calm, methodical fear, and holding a fabricated document he believed was real, Nate went to Clara's apartment on a Tuesday evening and told her he did not believe the baby was his. He did not scream it. He did not accuse her of anything specific beyond a vague reference to information he claimed to have. He simply said it, quietly, standing near her front door as though some part of him already knew he wouldn't be staying long enough to sit down. The way people say things they have convinced themselves are true because the alternative is too heavy to carry. And then he watched her face go through disbelief, then anger, and finally a stillness that frightened him more than either of the other two reactions had. Clara did not argue. She did not beg him to reconsider, did not ask to see whatever supposed proof he was referencing, some instinct in her recognizing that the question itself would be a kind of surrender she wasn't willing to make. She looked at him for a long moment, said that she understood exactly what kind of man he had decided to be, and asked him to leave. She would tell people later that the moment was almost peaceful in its clarity, the way certain kinds of grief can be, because at least now she knew precisely where she stood, and she would never again waste a single ounce of hope on a version of him that did not exist. She called Denise that same night, her voice steady in a way that worried Denise more than crying would have, and told her what had happened in short, flat sentences, as though she were reporting an accident rather than describing the end of the relationship that had shaped the last year of her life. Denise came over within the hour, and Margaret arrived the next morning before Clara had even asked her to, some instinctive maternal radar telling her that her daughter needed her before Clara had worked up the nerve to say so out loud. Margaret held her daughter in the small kitchen, where Clara had once told Nate she was pregnant, and said nothing about being right to have distrusted the Whitfield family from the beginning, though the thought crossed her mind more than once in the weeks that followed. She left that apartment that night certain of exactly one thing. She would never ask him for anything again. What she did not yet know was how far his family had already gone to make sure that certainty would hold. Clara gave birth 7 months later, alone except for her mother in the delivery room, to a son she named Eli, a name she chose because it belonged to no one in either family and felt, in some private way, like a fresh start unburdened by anyone else's expectations. The early months were the kind of exhausted and isolating that new single mothers rarely get to describe honestly, filled with 3 in the morning feedings, and the particular loneliness of scrolling through a phone with no one to text about it, made harder by the particular flavor of judgment that comes from being a young, unmarried woman who had, in certain circles that overlapped with the Whitfield family's social world, been quietly labeled as the woman who tried to trap a Whitfield son for his money. She never confirmed or denied the rumors, because there was no version of the truth that would not have humiliated her further, and because some part of her still could not fully explain, even to herself, why he had done what he did. Her closest friend, Denise, and her mother became the scaffolding that held her life together during those first exhausting years, showing up with meals and childcare, and the kind of unglamorous, consistent presence that Clara had learned long ago was the only proof of love that actually mattered, the same lesson her mother's whole life had already taught her once. Nate, meanwhile, built a life that looked successful from the outside and felt increasingly hollow from within. He threw himself into the family company with an intensity that his father praised and privately worried about, taking on projects that kept him working past midnight most nights, not because the work demanded it, but because exhaustion was easier to sit with than the silence that crept in whenever he stopped moving. His mother, satisfied that the situation had been contained, arranged an introduction to a woman named Whitney from a family the Whitfields considered appropriately matched, and within a year the two were engaged, a relationship that had all the outward architecture of a life well lived, photographs at galas, a ring that made the society pages, and none of the substance underneath it that Nate had once found so easily with Clara. That engagement quietly dissolved after less than a year, for reasons Nate gave vaguely to anyone who asked, citing timing and busy schedules, and never fully explained even to himself, though anyone paying close attention might have noticed a pattern in the small excuses he made to leave dinners early, or the way his eyes moved to his phone every time a name came up that started with the letter C. He started driving past Clara's apartment building on nights he told his mother he was working late, an old brick building on a street he had once known well, never once stopping the car, never once knocking on the door, just idling at the curb long enough to see a light on in a window before driving away again, telling himself each time that this would be the last time, and finding himself back there again within a matter of weeks. On one of those nights, nearly a year after the breakup, he watched from his car as Clara walked out of the building pushing a stroller, laughing at something Denise had said beside her. And the ordinary, uncomplicated happiness on her face in that moment did something to him that his mother's careful arguments about legacy and reputation had never quite managed to do. It planted a doubt he could not fully articulate yet, a small crack in the story he had built for himself, though it would take him nearly another year to follow that crack all the way down to what was actually underneath it. What neither Nate nor Clara knew during those 2 years was that Julian had played a quiet role in keeping them apart that went beyond a single rude comment at a coffee shop years earlier. Resentful of his older brother's position, as heir and increasingly aware of how precarious that position had become in their mother's eyes, after the scandal of an unplanned child threatened to become public, Julian had made himself useful to Alina in ways he never disclosed to Nate. He had a friend from college who worked at the design firm where Clara was employed, and through occasional, seemingly casual conversations, he gathered small pieces of information about Clara's life over those 2 years, where she was working, whether she was dating anyone, whether she seemed to be moving on. Information he passed along to his mother under the guise of simply keeping the family informed. Information Alina used not out of any particular malice toward Clara as a person, but out of a cold, practical determination to make sure the situation stayed exactly as contained as she had originally intended it to be. Julian told himself he was protecting the family. In quieter moments, lying awake at night in the guest wing of a house that had never quite felt like it belonged to him the way it belonged to his brother, he suspected he was protecting his own inheritance, and that the two motivations had simply become impossible to separate. There was a moment, roughly a year and a half into this unraveling, when Nate came dangerously close to learning the truth by accident. He had run into Rosalind, the housekeeper who had first reported Clara's pregnancy to Alina at a family gathering, and in an offhand comment about how quickly time passed, she mentioned Eli's age with a specificity that made Nate pause, a passing remark that suggested the household staff had been tracking a timeline he had never asked anyone to track. He almost asked her what she meant. He almost followed that thread. But his mother appeared at his elbow at that exact moment with a question about the evening's seating arrangement, and the thread went unpulled for another 6 months. A small missed opportunity that Nate would later think about more than almost anything else in the entire 2 years, wondering how much earlier everything might have changed if he had simply asked one more question that night. The truth that finally broke everything open arrived not through confrontation, but through fear. The particular kind of fear that makes people confess things they had planned on taking to their graves. Alina Whitfield, facing a sudden and serious health scare that put her in a hospital bed for the better part of a week, after a cardiac episode that no one in the family had seen coming, found herself confronting her own mortality in a way that rearranged her priorities more thoroughly than any argument ever could have. It was in that hospital room, late one night with only Nate sitting beside her bed, because Julian had gone home to sleep and Robert was packing the hallway on a phone call, that she finally told her son what she had actually done 2 years earlier. She told him about Rosalind's report, about the manufactured lab document, about the friend at the private diagnostic lab who had done the favor without asking many questions, about the calculated timing of showing him that document at the precise moment his fear had made him most susceptible to believing it. She told him she had done it to protect what his father had built. She told him, in a confession that surprised even her with how long it had been buried, that she had done it because she remembered, decades earlier, being the wrong woman for a Whitfield man herself before she'd married into the family. A young woman from a family with no name and no money who had been quietly investigated and nearly driven off by Robert's own mother before Robert had defied his family to marry her anyway. And how she had spent the rest of her life making sure no one else could ever occupy the position of outsider that she herself had once fought so hard to escape. Nate sat in that hospital room and felt something in him go cold and then break entirely. The particular kind of breaking that happens when a person realizes the fear that shaped the worst decision of their life was not even their own fear, but a story someone else had planted and cultivated in him for reasons that had almost nothing to do with him at all. reasons rooted in a wound his mother had carried since before he was born and had never once mentioned to him. He thought of 2 years spent believing he had simply lacked the courage to face an uncomfortable truth, when in fact he had been handed a lie dressed up as evidence, a lie he had been desperate enough to believe, because believing it was so much easier than defying his mother the way his father once had for her. He thought about a son he had never met, a son who was, by then, walking and talking and asking questions about the world, a son who existed entirely outside the 2 years of Nate's life that this single fabricated piece of paper had stolen from both of them. He left the hospital that night, sat in his car in the parking garage for nearly an hour without starting the engine, and for the first time in 2 years, allowed himself to fully feel the size of what had actually happened. It took Nate several more weeks after his mother's confession to work up the nerve to appear at Clara's door, weeks in which he confirmed the truth privately through a different, independent lab, weeks in which he confronted Julian directly after piecing together the timeline of information his brother had been quietly feeding their mother. An accusation Julian did not deny so much as deflect, insisting he had only ever wanted to keep the family informed. A defense that satisfied neither of them and left the two brothers in a strained, unresolved silence that would take much longer than a single conversation to repair. When Nate finally stood on Clara's porch, the small wrapped gift in his hands felt suddenly foolish, a small object entirely inadequate to the size of what he was there to ask for. But he knocked anyway, because the alternative was continuing to live inside a silence that had already cost him 2 years he would never get back. Clara opened the door and felt something complicated move through her at the sight of him, not the shattering grief of 2 years earlier, because that particular grief had long since been survived, and, in its own way, healed over, but something closer to a wary, guarded curiosity about what could possibly have brought him back now, after all this time, after she had built a life that no longer had a hole in it shaped like him. She listened to what he had to say, standing in the doorway rather than inviting him in, the confession about the fabricated test, his mother's fear, his brother's quiet involvement, the entire architecture of the lie laid bare in a conversation that took nearly an hour and left both of them exhausted in different ways. She found that understanding the reasons behind his choice did not erase the choice itself, though it did, to her own surprise, soften something in her that she had assumed would remain hard forever. She told him that she needed time before she could decide what, if anything, this meant for the future, and that whatever happened between the two of them, any relationship with Eli would have to be built slowly, on Eli's terms and at Eli's pace, not as an entitlement Nate believed he had suddenly earned back simply by finally telling the truth. Over the following months, Nate met his son for the first time, carefully, without rushing anything, sitting on the floor of Clara's living room while a 2-year-old regarded him with the frank, unimpressed curiosity that children reserve for strangers, bringing over a small toy truck and setting it down between them without a word. An unremarkable gesture that Nate would later describe as one of the most significant moments of his life. He came back the following week, and the week after that, slowly becoming a small, consistent presence in Eli's life, rather than the sudden dramatic reappearance he might once have imagined, learning the particular discipline of showing up reliably in small ways rather than grandly in large ones. A lesson that Clara, watching from the kitchen doorway some evenings, recognized as the same lesson her own mother had spent a lifetime teaching her without ever saying it out loud. Eleanor, weakened by illness and by the collapse of the careful architecture of secrecy she had spent her life building, found herself increasingly isolated from a family that no longer needed her permission to make its own decisions, watching from a distance as her sons quietly redrew the boundaries of their lives without consulting her the way they once had. Robert, learning the full truth some months after Nate did, found himself in the strange position of forgiving his wife for a decision he could not fully condone, recognizing in her fear an echo of his own family's cruelty toward her decades earlier, though the marriage that followed carried a new and permanent distance that had not been there before. Julian's relationship with his brother remained strained, rebuilt slowly and imperfectly over the better part of a year, through short, awkward conversations that gradually became slightly less awkward. The kind of repair that leaves visible seams rather than pretending the break never happened. Clara never fully returned to the version of hope she had once carried for Nate in the earliest days of their relationship. And she was honest with herself that some things, once broken by a 2-year absence built on a lie, do not simply reset to what they were before. What she found instead was something more modest and, in its own way, more durable. A working relationship between two parents who had both been harmed by a decision neither of them had actually made freely, and who now had the chance to build something new out of the wreckage, not a fairy tale reunion, but a slow, deliberate second chance at honesty, one that Eli would grow up inside of rather than around, and one that neither of them took for granted a single day of. He spent 2 years believing he had simply lost her to indifference and time, when the truth was that he had lost her to a lie his own family had told for him before he was even given the chance to tell the truth himself. It raises a question worth sitting with long after this story ends. If the truth had come from him in the beginning, spoken plainly, and without his mother's calculated fear standing between him and the people who loved him, do you think it would have changed everything? Or by the time the confession finally came, had too much already been lost for the truth to fully make it right again? If you've made it this far, thank you for spending this time with us and with Clara and Nate's story. These are the kinds of stories that stay with us because they are, in their own quiet way, about all of us, about the fear we let speak for us instead of speaking for ourselves, and about what it costs the people we love when we let that fear win. If this story moved you, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Scars and Stories, where we explore the moments that break families apart and the moments, however imperfect, that sometimes bring them back together. Thank you so much for watching, and we hope to see you again in our next story.